abnormal psych through film, where we explore and unpack popular media's portrayal of mental illness. My name is John Martin. I'm a clinical social worker and owner of Autumn's Harbor Psychotherapy. Movies have been a passion of mine my whole life for their ability to transport you into another world. They tell stories that are connected to who we are as human beings and that are really important for our mental health. Mental health is not just for people who suffer from psychological disorders. It's for all of us. It's an inextricable part of the human condition. I hope that this series can elevate your knowledge of mental health disorders and how treating them and addressing them can be useful for you in your life. Remember, keep your minds open and your screens lit. Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Silence of the Lambs. Holy shit. This movie, I haven't watched this movie in probably decades, and when I watched it again, I realized how good of a movie this is. I didn't realize that I think it won 5 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Anthony Hopkins, Best Actress, Jodie Foster, and then Best Screenplay. The first horror movie ever to do that. And the interesting thing about the Anthony Hopkins win is that he was only on the screen for 16 minutes in this film, which is so hard for me to believe as I was watching it. I mean, he's so captivating that he seemed to just envelop the movie. I don't even know where to begin. This film follows a young FBI agent. In fact, at the beginning of the film, she is still in school, in training, and she gets assigned this case of Buffalo Bill, this serial killer who is currently killing women and using their skin for unknown reasons. And she is tasked with speaking with Hannibal Lecter, the notorious cannibal, in order to develop a psychological profile for Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, and of course Hannibal Lecter, played by the great Anthony Hopkins. And so she ends up developing this relationship with him that is it's very interesting. She just immediately is vulnerable and frank with him and honest, which he really appreciated. And as the movie goes on, she just kind of gets deeper and deeper into the saga of this serial killer in Buffalo Bill, but also the mindset of Hannibal Lecter. And it's just such a good psychological thriller. And so what we're going to talk about with regard to the psychological disorder in this film is Antisocial Personality Disorder. This is a very highly stigmatized disorder, probably for good reason. And it is something that is often portrayed in popular film because it is so captivating. There's this kind of morbid curiosity, we all kind of like true crime and try to understand the minds of serial killers, and there's something fascinating about it. And so the antisocial personality disorder is the clinical term. Often it's referred to as a psychopath or psychopathy, or a sociopath or a sociopathy. But psychopath and sociopath are actually not clinical terms, but they are relevant. They're used often in criminology. They're used often in research. So they do have meaning. They're just not diagnostic in nature. And so what is antisocial personality disorder? Well, essentially, it's this pervasive pattern of violating the rights of others. There seems to be no empathy for other people's feelings, their needs, what happens to them. It's a very egocentric mindset. And the nature of personality disorders is that they are chronic, stable personality types. Now, these aren't something that really change all that much. And this is one aspect that makes them very difficult to treat, is that you're oftentimes treating the symptoms, trying to teach them cognitive skills, behavior skills, but that personality type is there. It's just kind of a part of them. And so there's other aspects of antisocial personality disorder. There's impulsivity, there's aggressiveness, lack of remorse, irritability, aggressiveness, and these are all things that have to be present before the age of 15. So it's called something different before the age of 15. It's called a conduct disorder. So in children, this might manifest in hurting animals, hurting people, theft, vandalism, breaking the law, criminal activity, just violating the rules, truancy, things like that. Things that pretty evidently fall outside of the scope of what we would think of as normative, kid stuff. This is a little more sinister in nature. So a stereotype that exists among individuals with this disorder is that they're all serial killers. And this is certainly not true. I would probably say a small percentage of people with antisocial personality disorders are serial killers. However, probably all serial killers meet diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, specifically being a psychopath. So the psychopath can be very high functioning, as you're going to see in Hannibal Lecter. Anthony Hopkins' character is the quintessential psychopath. I mean, he is just, it's wild. And so I think it's going to be really fun to unpack this. So there are two individuals in this film with antisocial personality disorder. One, of course, is Hannibal Lecter. The other is a fella named Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill is the person that they are chasing in this film. Hannibal is already imprisoned. He is a psychiatrist that has already been charged and convicted with multiple murders where he has eaten his victims. And while these two individuals both have antisocial personality disorder, they're very different in their presentation. Dr. Lecter he is suave, he's charming, he's brilliant, he is very manipulative, very cunning. You get the sense that everything he's doing in the film is a test. Everything he says to Clarice is a test. It's like he wants to see how she's going to react. He's gathering information that he can use later on in order to serve his needs. And Anthony Hopkins does just a phenomenal job portraying this character. I mean, it's arguably one of the most well-known villainous roles in all of film. When you say Hannibal Lecter, you think of Anthony Hopkins and you see him standing in that jail cell, just staring at Clarice, and oh man, it is absolutely chilling. Buffalo Bill, on the other hand, he is not sophisticated. He is not refined. He very clearly has a history of violence and abuse. Dr. Lecter refers to this, in his kind of systematic abuse in childhood, which undoubtedly played a role in the development of his pathology. One of the things that Dr. Lecter says is that through his systematic abuse as a child, he came to hate himself. And this kind of bred this desire in Bill to transform himself. And this is where the theme of the butterfly comes into play, and the fact that he is in fact skinning his victims and creating a suit of human skin, a female suit, because he wants to transform. But he's rough around the edges. He's not well spoken. He's pretty much a hermit. He's fumbly. He's very when they get to his house at the end of the film, it's filthy. It's just very chaotic, very unsophisticated. Very, very different than Hannibal, who is very worldly, very cultured, very smart. And so it's a nice kind of juxtaposition between these two characters, and you can see the continuum within a particular diagnosis, that it can look very different. And so Anthony Hopkins, in preparation for this film, he studied Charles Manson. He tried to study his mannerisms to try to kind of get inside the mind of a serial killer. I did read also that these characters were loosely based in real life people. And yeah, so let's dive into the film. The film is packed. It's just packed with different scenes and themes and imagery. It starts out with Clarice kind of going through her routine of training at, I think she's trying to become an FBI profiler. And so she ends up being assigned to the Buffalo Bill case. And there's a very, very strong theme in this film of gender inequality. Here's Clarice, who is a young woman, attractive young woman, small stature, meek, who is in a world of, macho men, police officers, FBI agents, and serial killers. And so she doesn't quite fit in, and she's objectified at many points in the film. And it's appropriate that she's the one who ultimately, well, I won't say it. But yeah, so that's evident pretty early on in the film, and she's picked for that reason to talk to Dr. Lecter, because he's very sharp, and he knows when someone's trying to get one over or manipulate him. And the director of the profiling division thought that she would be someone who could possibly get through to him, because they're trying to get information from him. So there's a scene right at the beginning of the film where she goes and visits Hannibal Lecter in his cell, and it is a quintessential scene, a famous scene. She goes down into this dungeon, and she walks down the hall, and people are, yelling at her. One individual throws semen at her. It's just like, what is going on? And as she walks down to his cell and she comes past the corridor, he's standing there with his hands behind his back, straight as a board, looking at her. And it's just like, I get chills just thinking about it. There's so many great lines in this film. And I think it's at this point where he says, "Hello, Clarice." And you're just like, oh man, it's just so bone chilling. And they end up having a conversation, and he's really interested in getting personal information from her. In fact, he often says to her, "Quid pro quo, doctor," because he wants, if he's going to give her some information, he wants information. So he has her tell stories to him about her life and about what makes her tick, very personal, very intimate things that he, definitely uses for his own personal reasons. And so they start this kind of relationship of, slowly peeling back the onion, and ultimately Clarice is trying to get something out of him. He's trying to get something out of her, right? She's trying to get information about Bill and to try to kind of unpack this, profile so that they can catch him. And perhaps one of the most famous lines of the film happens in this scene. He says, "I ate his liver with a can of fava beans and a nice Chianti." Oh man, it's unbelievable. And he improvised that. That was not in the script. And there's another famous scene later on in the film that was improvised as well that I'll get to in a little bit. And so she goes out, he kind of gives her little breadcrumbs. He's like, okay, here, go check out this storage unit. Go check out this individual. Here's a former patient of mine. And so she kind of goes out and, starts investigating these things. So the movie cuts to kind of the introduction of Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, who does an equally amazing job in this role. In fact, he was reluctant to take this role because he was worried about being typecast as this kind of actor. And he was very intentional following this movie, not accepting any more roles in the same vein. And so he is putting the couch into a van, and he's got a fake cast on, and he's fumbling about. And this young lady, her name's Catherine, sees him and offers to help. And he ends up luring her into the van, pushes her into the van, knocks her out, right? And he's captured her. She ends up in this well in his house that a number of very famous scenes happen as well. And so a little bit after this, Clarice and Lecter are continuing to meet sporadically throughout the film. And she's getting little bits and pieces of information, and he's getting bits and pieces of information. And he starts to learn a little bit about her story. And this is where we get the title of the film, The Silence of the Lambs. And he learns that Clarice lost her mother when she was very young, and then her father died when she was 10 years old. He was shot in the line of duty. He was a police officer. And she was then taken to live with her aunt and uncle on a farm. And they had sheep and cows, I think. And one night she is awakened by the sounds of screaming. And she goes to see what's going on, and she finds these lambs screaming in this barn as they're being slaughtered. And she's obviously very, very distressed by this. And she opens the gate and tries to get them to leave. They won't leave. So she grabs one. She tries to save it. And it's a very emotional story that she tells. And it ultimately explains why she's there. The idea is that she couldn't save the lambs. And so she's trying to redeem herself by becoming an FBI agent and helping to save victims. And so this is something that Lecter uses periodically throughout the film with regard to the silencing of the lambs. And so shortly after this, it pans back to the hole at Buffalo Bill's house where they're keeping Catherine Martin. And she's pleading with him to let her go, and he lowers down lotion in a basket. And another very famous line, "It puts the lotion on its skin before it gets the hose again." And then they go back and forth, and he says, "Put the lotion in the basket." And it's just one of these lines where you're like, oh my gosh, it's so iconic. And it's around this time that we learn about Bill's affinity for moths. That's kind of his calling card. They find moths embedded in the throat of his victims. And he's drawn to them because of their transformative nature, right? In that they go into a cocoon and they kind of are born a beautiful butterfly or moth. And this is how he sees himself. This is what he's trying to do. He's trying to be born again through this suit that he's building. And it's obviously twisted and sadistic, but you can understand kind of what he's trying to do in his kind of twisted mind. And so they end up making a deal with Hannibal that if he will continue to give information, because they discover that Hannibal actually has a connection with Bill. A former patient of Hannibal was a victim of Buffalo Bill. So they kind of had run-ins with each other, or at least loose knowledge about each other. And so Hannibal, of course, leverages that to get transferred to a different facility that's a little bigger, and he gets nice food, he's able to draw, he gets to listen to music, he's not in this dungeon. And it's there that he is able to kind of finagle a way out. He's able to escape, and it's a really gruesome scene where he's able to pick the lock on his handcuffs. He attacks these two police officers. He cuts one of their faces off and uses that to escape. They find one of the officers strung up with his gut. I mean, it's just a gruesome scene, and it really gets to the nature of, this particular type of psychopath who is violent and has no remorse. This is very callous, and there's also, I think, an addictive component to this. I think there's a rush that they get from killing, and this becomes obsessive and kind of follows the pattern of an addiction. And they don't really talk about this in the film, but nonetheless, the nature of a serial killer, right, they're doing it over and over and over again, would suggest there's some type of compulsive, perhaps addictive quality to what's going on. And so it pans back to Buffalo Bill in another just really remarkable scene where he's dancing, and he's got the cutout scalp of a woman with the hair on his head, and he's naked and he's dancing, and he ends up tucking his genitals between his legs, and he shows himself, and it's just such a raw scene. This scene was also improvised, so Ted Levine did that just on the spur of the moment, and that was not in the script. So ultimately what happens is Clarice finds Bill's house. They get into a scuffle, and ultimately she kills him. And it's a very dramatic climax of the movie, and she ends up being accepted into the FBI. And then at the very end of the film, she receives a call from Dr. Lecter, and he is in an unknown location, and he's checking in on her, and he asks her, are the lambs still screaming, or something like that, in his voice. And he's watching one of the doctors so when Hannibal is in the first prison, the doctor that's over the prison is just not a nice guy, and he kind of punishes Lecter and he antagonizes Lecter. So Lecter's after him, and at the end of the film he says, "I'm having a friend for dinner," and then the movie ends. I highly recommend you watch this movie again, because I'm sure you've seen it. But if you haven't seen it, you gotta watch it. It's so good. I think it's directed by Jonathan Demme. Just an excellent film. So I'll talk briefly about treatment. Unfortunately, this condition is very, very difficult to treat. And that's for a number of reasons. We talked about kind of the chronic, stable nature of the disorder, in that it's really it's not something that is transient. And so that stable nature makes it really difficult to change. Plus, there's often not a lot of motivation, because people with antisocial personality disorder often don't think they have a problem. And if they were to think they had a problem, they probably enjoy it to a certain extent. And that's a generalization. Of course, that's not everyone. I don't mean to paint them into a box. But oftentimes people with this disorder have co-occurring mental health issues, depression, anxiety, ADHD, substance use disorder, PTSD, etc. And so oftentimes you're treating those. But the general approach is a cognitive behavioral approach. A specific modality that's used is called dialectical behavior therapy, which was developed by Marsha Linehan to treat another personality disorder called borderline personality disorder. So DBT is primarily studied and evidence-based for borderline. However, borderline and antisocial both exist in what we call cluster B for personality disorders. There's A, B, and C. And within the B cluster, these are kind of dramatic, erratic types of disorders, where you have histrionic, which is very attention-seeking, very dramatic, very look at me. Then you have antisocial, you have borderline, you have narcissistic. And so there is some overlap in these, particularly in the poor emotional regulation, and a big part of attachment, right? Very difficult in relationships relating to people, attachment styles. Oftentimes there's attachment issues in childhood. So dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, is essentially a modality that it's very skills based. So it's essentially teaching the person skills, and those skills fall under 4 dimensions. The first dimension is mindfulness. And so mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to the here and now without judgment. And this is teaching a person to really be in touch with how they are thinking and feeling in the moment. So it's really encouraging the person to be present, to be fully engaged in the moment. The 2 predominant pathways to the present moment are the breath and the body, sensations. And so it's teaching them skills to tap into the present moment. The second domain or dimension is called emotional regulation. And this is an idea that I've talked about before with regard to the nature of emotions being kind of our gas pedal, and that there needs to be a complementary system that balances that out or regulates that, which in DBT is called our reasonable self. So you have the emotional self, you have the reasonable self, and then there's a point where the 2 intersect that's called the wise mind. This is often referred to as the middle path. So this is the part that's balanced, because emotions are important. They're giving us vital information about our environment and about our values. And we have to be attentive to them. We also have to apply reason, because if you remember, emotions aren't smart, right? So we have to bring in reason and logic to process our emotion and arrive at a wise decision. So teaching these kinds of skills, one of my favorite skills, I think it's actually a distress tolerance skill, but is called effective rethinking and paired relaxation. And so what this is taking a stressful situation and identifying the automatic maladaptive thoughts that might come with that. So let's say that your stressor is a test that's coming up. You have a biology exam, and your automatic thoughts are, I'm not smart, I'm gonna fail. Okay, right? This creates anxiety. And so effective rethinking and paired relaxation asks the person to stop, feel, and think, right? What would you prefer? How would you prefer to think about this, right? If you could have it a different way, how would you prefer to think about this? That if I prepare, that I will be successful. Okay, that's an alternative thought. So then what you would do is you would bring up the stressor, okay? Bring it to your mind, breathe in, and as you breathe in, you recite the positive thought, right? If I study, I will do well. And as you breathe out, you say relax. And you do that over and over again. You do that every day until the test, right? And you're creating this connection between the stressor and this thought, but also being relaxed. So this is a great skill with DBT. The next dimension is called distress tolerance. This really tells people how to respond in crisis situations. So how we respond in a kind of moderately stressful situation, in a crisis situation, is very different. When we're in crisis, our brains are literally diverted to a different pathways, different neural pathways that are meant to have quick action and mobilize us. Whereas when we're in a space of safety and connection, different connections in the brain that allow us to process and open up our thinking to bring in different perspectives. And so distress tolerance is teaching someone how to come down from a crisis situation. So it might involve splashing cold water on your face, intense exercise, diaphragmatic breathing, things like this. And then the last dimension is interpersonal effectiveness. So remember, a big component of all personality disorders, but in particular antisocial, is the difficulty in connecting with others and really ineffective social strategies and relationships. So it's teaching them how to communicate, it's teaching them how to get their needs met, it's teaching them how to establish relationships, it's teaching them how to maintain relationships. So these can all be really important skills for someone with antisocial personality disorder. There's certainly other things to consider. Sometimes medications are used, whether it's mood stabilizers, antidepressants, antipsychotic medications. I'm not a physician, so I don't prescribe medications. And I do not believe there are any FDA-approved medications for antisocial. I don't think there are. I could be wrong about that, but sometimes they are used off-label for that. And so, but gosh, could you imagine treating Hannibal Lecter? I mean, how's that going to work out, right? So, it's one of those things where you don't want to say it's a hopeless condition, but there's certainly a lot of challenges. So this film was so good. Please, please, please watch it. And I really have enjoyed this week. This has been really one of my favorites. So thank you for watching. Remember, keep your minds open and your screens lit.